We're fast approaching the 60th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy of the United States on the 22nd of November 1963 in Dallas, Texas. And that got me thinking. It got me thinking about how long one version of events was believed because it was rammed down the throats of the people, in spite of questions being asked for the longest time. Not just because of thinking about JFK, but I honestly don't know how much more ridiculously, hysterically inept our would-be totalitarian overlords have to get. How much more obvious their playbook has to be, how blatantly one-dimensionally predictable their behaviour must become before finally enough of us, enough of the general population just guffaws into the faces of our supposed oppressors, and spins them around and whips down their trousers and drives them out of town with a succession of swift kicks up the bahookie. It's the textbook definition, I would say, the textbook definition of farcical. I mean, do they have to put on white face, red noses and giant shoes and turn up in a little car from which the doors fall off and the wheels fall off and the horn goes mwah, mwah, before everyone recognises them as the clowns, the malevolent clowns they are? In my mind's eye, I see them all posing in front of full-length mirrors, all dressed up in their Ming the Merciless outfits and practising their scariest Big Brother stares while they tell each other that any day now they'll be sat on their giant thrones. It's truly, truly beyond absurd to me now what they keep getting away with. I mean, I was oblivious for the longest time as well, and I make no bones about that, but I've seen what they're up to for a long time. And I suppose it's always frustrating when you can see something that other people don't or refuse to see. But there's no getting away from how much too many people keep letting the baddies away with. As I say, later this month, it'll be the 60th anniversary of the murder of US President JFK, John F. Kennedy, in Dallas, Texas, on the 22nd of November 1963. We've all seen the images. We've all seen the Zapruder film. You've only got to mention the assassination of JFK, and you know, like, as though out of a Jack-in-the-Box, inside everyone's head opens the same set of pictures. Right away, though, the Americans and the wider world were told that JFK had been assassinated by a lone shooter, Lee Harvey Oswald, the patsy. A lone shooter who was himself famously, infamously shot and killed by another lone shooter, Jack Ruby, 2 days later, before the police could talk to Lee Harvey Oswald. How convenient was that? And from the beginning, there were many who poured scorn on the official version of events, but they were shouted down as conspiracy theorists. Now, that term conspiracy theorist, conspiracy theory, was applied by the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, in 1964. So it started being bandied about the year after the killing. And it was deliberately to discredit skeptics, for want of any other word, who had the temerity to question the Warren Commission's conclusion that JFK had been the victim of a lone shooter. And complicit media made a veritable campaign of the ridiculing and dismissing of all questions and alternative explanations for the murder, making it one of the most effective propaganda initiatives of all time. It's taken decades for the truth to come out, but by now, the oft-told, the oft-made assertion that JFK was murdered not by Lee Harvey Oswald, but by the CIA circulates freely. The authorities don't even bother to dispute it anymore. Maybe it's because enough time's been deemed to have passed. This year, no lesser figure than Robert Kennedy Jr., who's now running a successful campaign to replace Joe Biden as US president in the 2024, next year, the elections, he went public with his backing of the theory that it was the CIA that murdered his uncle. Robert Kennedy Jr. says, essentially without contradiction, that JFK was murdered by the CIA because he had refused to commit US forces to war in Vietnam, categorically against the wishes of the military-industrial complex that stood to make more billions of dollars from yet another war. And in an interview that Robert Kennedy Jr. gave to a New York radio station in the summer just past, he said, "When my uncle was president, he was surrounded by a military-industrial complex and intelligence apparatus that was constantly trying to get him to go to war in Laos, Vietnam, and so on. He refused. He said that the job of the American presidency is to keep the nation out of war." And Bobby Kennedy Jr. said there is overwhelming evidence that the CIA was involved in his murder. And he said, it was an interview with a New York City radio station, WABC 770. He said, "I think it's beyond a reasonable doubt at this point." And he furthermore talked about CIA involvement in his own father's murder. Robert F. Kennedy Sr., a former US Attorney General, who was shot and killed in Los Angeles while campaigning for the presidency in 1968. Robert Kennedy Jr. said evidence of CIA involvement in his father's death is, quote, "very convincing, but it is circumstantial." So it's taken years to get past that original label, conspiracy theory, and to talk about much more credible explanations for what really happened to JFK and why. 6 decades. But still, it's finally out there. In the clown world we inhabit, a lethally dangerous clown world, but a clown world just the same, the truth shrugs off the conspiracy theory label much more quickly. 3 years after the launch of COVID, people are talking freely and openly about things that were, not so very long ago, strictly forbidden and to be dismissed as more conspiracy theory. That COVID has been being played around with and patented for decades, that the products marketed and pushed as vaccines were never safe or effective, that face masks were worse than useless, that lockdowns were suicidally destructive to health and the economy, that the powers that be knew all about the dangers from the beginning, from before the beginning. All of that was to be dismissed as conspiracy theory, but not anymore. Now all of the above and more discussed freely. In the past couple of weeks just, the AstraZeneca so-called vaccine that was administered to millions has been revealed as defective. That's the word officially being used to describe it, defective. Now that's the same AstraZeneca jab that scored a damehood for its co-creator, Professor Sarah Gilbert. And last time I checked, she still had the gong and happy memories of the standing ovation she got from the crowd at Wimbledon. Defective. But there you go. Now, when COVID ran out of steam as the main driver of fear in the general population, we were handed war in Ukraine, just like that. Just so convenient. And questions were asked right away about that place and about that war. Questions were asked about the 2014 coup d'etat engineered by Victoria Nuland when she was then US Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia. About the bombing of the Russian enclaves by Ukraine, bombing of the Russian enclaves in the Donbass, about the motivation being the fight to preserve democracy. Was it really? About the hundreds of billions of dollars and euros and pounds being siphoned through one of the most corrupt countries on earth. About Nazis in the Ukrainian armed forces. All of that and more, all those questions were loudly and angrily dismissed. You're a bunch of cranks, they said. Get to the patriotic business in hand. Well, now the West is backing away from Ukraine faster than a piano falling out of a window. And by now, 500,000 Ukrainians And thousands, tens of thousands of Russians are uselessly, pointlessly dead. And for what? Apart from money and power. What was always going to happen, which is to say Russia taking the Donbass, is shortly going to happen. And what about the Nord Stream pipeline? Remember that one? The one that was blown up. The one that the US and the West blamed on Russian sabotage. That Nord Stream pipeline. Contrary voices at the time pointed out how even before Russia invaded Ukraine, Joe Biden was telling the world that in the event of an invasion, that pipeline would be no more. Now, didn't that make it at least possible, if not likely, that when it was blown up, that it had been blown up not by Russia who could simply have turned off the tap on what was a big expensive bit of their own infrastructure? Isn't it more likely that it was blown up by the West, some part of the West? But saying as much at the time was dismissed as more conspiracy theory. And yet, no lesser figure than the US journalistic legend Seymour Hersh has published about how that pipeline was indeed blown up by people sponsored by the United States of America. Now that's the same Pulitzer Prize winning Seymour Hersh, the same that broke the story of the My Lai massacre of 500 Vietnamese civilians by US Marines. Hersh claimed that the planning for the US mission to hit the Nord Stream pipeline started in the December of 2021. The December of 2021. And that it was designed to lock European allies into support for Ukraine at a time when some were wavering. Quote, "The fear was Europe would walk away from the war," said Hersh. Think about that. Remember Hillary Clinton's claims about how Donald Trump had colluded with the Russians in pursuit of power? A complete falsehood made up by Hillary Clinton. And the lies just keep coming. And the dupes believe them every time. Now we're being told all sorts about the war between Israel and Hamas, and the same people are believing everything they're told, overlooking, among other facts, that Hamas was in part Israel's own creation, a cynical effort to destroy the moderate secular coalition of Arab populations that was Fatah and the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. How long before the whole of the truth comes out in relation to whatever the hell's going on there? But that millions of people all around the world have marched in recent days to demand a ceasefire and an end to the slaughter of civilians, women, children, old men in Gaza, that must count for something. That's populations flying in the face of their governments and in the face of their media. What's it all about, you might ask? What's it all about? Well, it's about what it's always been about, which is a carefully curated, highly funded, highly organised, scandalously cynical effort to keep the mass of the world's population in a perpetual state of fear. The better to have those people not just submit to, but actively to cry out for more state control to be imposed on their lives. But here's the thing, though. They call people like me conspiracy theorists, but name-calling is just another of their blunt tools. A tool blunted not least by incessant overuse. I've been being called conspiracy theorist for years now. I'll tell you what conspiracy theorist means. It means I'm right. I was right before, I'm right now, and I'll be right again in the near future. Those seeking to steal our freedoms and our lives are clowns, and we are watching a joke. It's the sickest joke of all time, but it's a joke. And if we don't call it for what it is now, then the sickest joke of all time will be on us, and we will only have ourselves to blame.